Great. I will start with a short introduction, although the word short is a little bit misleading here because I cannot get short introduction for you both guys because I saw that Joel has a CV on more than 40 pages and but to cut it short as much as I can, Joel is a professor of economics at the University of Michigan, studied at the Princeton University, London School of Economics, has a Ph.D. in economics from Harvard University, countless books and publications, um, including appearances in New York Times, CNBC, Fox News, etc. Joel is from New Jersey, so uh, that would be if I need to uh, get some highlights on the books Joel has written. It's the titles are Taxing Ourselves, Tax Systems, Taxes in America, Taxing Corporate Income in the 21st Century, Tax Policy in the Real World. Uh, does Atlas Shrug, the economic consequences of taxing the rich, the rethinking estate and gift taxation, tax progressivity, and income inequality, and of course the latest book, Rebellion, Rascals and Revenue, which we are going to talk about some more later on. An interesting fact is this Ig Nobel Prize I came across for a paper concluding that people find a way to postpone their death if that would qualify them for a lower rate of inheritance tax. And the prize is to honor achievements that first make people laugh and then make them think. Uh, Joel, is there a story behind this prize?
There's more than one story behind that prize. It began as a serious academic research question, how taxes affect people's behavior. And economists have studied lots and lots of different aspects of behavior. My graduate student, Wojtek Kopczak, from Poland, who is now a professor at Columbia University. He was a Ph.D. student of mine at the time, and we were doing research on how estate taxes affect behavior. And I think more or less simultaneously, we realized we have the data available to study this question of whether anticipated changes in the estate tax actually changed when people die, or at least when they told the tax authority when they died. And we looked into the question and noticed that other social scientists, not economists, had written about this and had said that, oh, it seems like in China, elderly people postpone their deaths so they can be with their family for the holiday. And so it seemed like it was possible. And we looked at the data, and sure enough, there is evidence that people rich enough to be subject to estate tax, some of them anyway, would postpone their death to save their heirs on taxes, and others would actually accelerate their death, although that happens less often, to save their heirs on estate tax, depending on whether the tax rates are going to go up or down. So that's how it started. But my favorite story about this is shorter. Later, many years later, I was being vetted for security clearance, and somebody came to my office at Michigan to ask me some questions and had my CV in front of him. And he's kind of leafing through it. And at one point he looks up and he says to me, "Professor Slemrod, I see that you've won a Nobel Prize." And I said, "Well, not exactly a Nobel Prize." I found it amusing that he thought I would mention a Nobel Prize on like page 13 of my CV rather than have it in bold headlines on the front page.
Right. Um, we will we will return a little bit to this topic later on, but also I would like to have a brief intro to Michael Keane, deputy. I heard just for several more weeks, deputy director of the Fiscal Affairs department at IMF, and previously Michael was professor of economics at the University of Essex and visiting professor at Kyoto and Queens Universities, has led technical assistance missions to nearly 30 countries on a wide range of issues of tax policy, consulted the World Bank, European Commission, and private sector, served the board of the on the board of the National Tax Association in the US, and was the editor on the editorial boards of many journals. Of course, is an author of not only the latest book that I already mentioned, Rebellion, Rascals and Revenue, that we're going to talk about, but also the Modern VAT, taxing profits in a global economy, taxation of petroleum and minerals, changing customs, Sweden's welfare state, digital revolutions in public finance, and of course, countless publications and presentations. And you're based in Washington, D.C. Have I missed anything important from both of you?
I don't think so. I think the word tax figured prominently for both of us, which gives a pretty good impression.
Right, right. Um, we started to talk a little bit about this Ig Nobel Prize. Uh, when I read your book, I must admit I'm only halfway through, but uh, I had a feeling that you both, with this book, might be a bit tired of the serious issues surrounding every of us, and trying to have some fun in the profession. But at the same time, it's a little bit like this Ig Nobel Prize that first it makes people laugh and then make them think. Is the is that along your lines of thinking while creating this book?
I would say that's a pretty good summary, actually. I think, yeah, the books have emerged over many years when Joel and I, for many years, were exchanging kind of weird, interesting stories about tax. And eventually, it was actually my partner, Joel, who decided or suggested we make it into a book. And it occurred to us that, yeah, there's a lot of kind of interesting, weird stories. But more than that, we could use these stories to actually convey some basic tax principles of both policy and administration
Mm.
in a way that was kind of entertaining and fun, because I think we do both feel that really our profession of particularly of tax economists haven't really done a great job of conveying more generally some of the basic ideas that we take for granted, ideas of excess burden, the kind of collateral damage of taxation, questions about who really bears the burden of taxation. So there were all kind of issues that we thought we could illuminate in a kind of enjoyable way by using some of these weird tax stories. Some of the tax stories probably don't have any useful tax lesson at all, but are nonetheless just fun. So I think you describe pretty much what we're trying to do. So we are trying to be entertaining, fun. But we're also trying to be rigorous in a kind of hopefully not too visible way, and truthful and accurate, and convey some, as we say, some basic principles in a relatively painless way.
Mm.
We think of it partly as a gift to people who are in the tax business, because although Mick and I find it fascinating, we've heard that other people think taxation is sort of dry and boring. And so we hope that from now on, when people in the tax business are at cocktail parties, they can tell these horrible, fascinating, weird stories. So at the end of it, people will be thinking, man, I wish I were in the tax business. This is great fun.
This was along my line of thinking for creating this podcast. And is that the reason why you decided to join pretty much a podcast from the other part of the world for somebody who you haven't heard of?
Well, we're trying to spread the word to people like you and people like in your audience. And so we're happy to get the opportunity for people to learn about our book. Of course, we want to encourage people to buy it and read it and tell their friends about it. But we think it's fascinating and interesting, and we hope we can convince more people of that.
And I guess one nice thing about taxation is it's kind of universal, right? Everybody has their experiences with taxation. It affects everybody's life. So in a way, everybody connects in some way to taxation. And so as Joel says, we're trying to kind of make that that interaction, that intersection a bit more both entertaining and something that people would be comfortable thinking about. And of course, we're always looking for more stories. So we hope that through the podcast, maybe we'll find out some more weird stories from other parts of the world, because we're sure there are plenty wherever we look. There are some bizarre, informative tax stories. So we're very much in the market for more stories.
Even though we've been working on this for a good 7 or 8 years and collecting stories for more than that, we still hear regularly from people who read the book or hear us talking about the book. We still hear more stories we hadn't heard of. So I think it's going to be an ongoing collection for us.
Great. And the previous guests of our podcast have told some fascinating stories as well. So I encourage to have a listen if you have time at some point. I before turning to the book, I wanted to ask some personal questions, if I may. That if right now, as we speak, there is Tokyo Olympics opening ceremony. Will you follow any of the events, and do you practice any sports yourself?
Yeah, I just called over to, I'm at home, I called over to my wife that the opening ceremonies are on TV, so she might be watching it now. Yeah, I follow sports, so I imagine I will watch some. I do less sports now than I used to, but back in the day, I played tennis and played golf and basketball. These days, I mostly walk. So my athletic endeavors have gotten more restricted as time has gone on.
For me, I confess I probably won't be watching much of the Olympics. I think my partner will, so I'll sort of politely sit there and feign interest and try to stay awake. I'm more a kind of a football guy, and I'm a Chelsea supporter, if that means anything. So we've had a great year at Chelsea. We won the European Champions League. I'm English, so we have our usual disappointment following the Euros. So I'm kind of burnt out a little bit on sport at the moment. So I'm looking forward to the England winning something in about 50 years again from now. So I'm a little burnt out on sport at the moment. But I'm trying to play a bit of tennis now and again, very badly. Yeah, very, very badly. But that's it.
Right. So hopefully I will get a chance to play golf with Joel together sometime.
Oh.
Great. And Joel, I saw that you are not a big social media fan. Is there a reason why?
Not really. It's not that I'm not a fan. I just haven't devoted the energy to learn about it. get involved, but that's certainly an accurate observation.
All right. And a small question about your bachelor degree. It's in arts, if I remember correctly. Is there a story behind that choice and switching to tax afterwards?
No, that's just how the degree is named. My undergraduate degree is, in fact, I was an economics major, so
All right.
that's a little misleading.
All right. And how you both started to work with tax issues?
Never heard this story from you, Mick.
Well, I think it's a very kind of boring story, really. I think I was studying economics at finishing up at Oxford, looking for a job, and there was my supervisor was a gentleman called John Kay, who people may know of, who sort of writes quite prominently now for the Ep.14 and others, and he was then establishing or kind of putting new life into something called the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, and basically he offered me a job. And that was it. So I think it was, but I think probably it was more John Kay's influence. He was very much working on tax issues at that stage, and he was a very inspiring mentor and teacher. And I guess the bug just bit me there, I think. So pretty simple. How about you, Joe?
Yeah, so I was, as I mentioned, an undergraduate economics major, and one of my favorite professors taught public finance, and he got me interested in it. And one reason I always liked the field is I liked the fact that things I was studying or working on could be on the front page of the newspaper the next day. That it was very much a topic that a lot of people cared about, and I always enjoyed that. And up till today, the stuff that I'm working on is very much the stuff of headlines in the States now.
Who was the professor, John?
His name was Jim Ohls, O-H-L-S. I think he left, well, I know he left academia soon after I had his class at Princeton. He worked at Mathematica for most of his career.
And how about the books you're normally reading? Are there any books normally on your reading table besides the ones on tax that you would like to recommend to our listeners?
Well, Mick just sent me an email yesterday about a book he's reading. I don't know if he wants to talk about it today.
It was an email to warn you not to read it, so maybe it was so bad you shouldn't read it if you think you're reading it. I don't know. I guess I normally have some fiction and a history book going on at the same time, or history and politics. So I'm reading a book, I can't remember the exact title, by this guy Fukuyama, on the growth of political order or whatever, which is pretty much fun. On the novel side, I guess, because I've just given up on one because it was so awful. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a novel I've read recently that I would recommend to someone. I can't remember the title of it. It's a novel. I'm very bad at remembering novels. It was a novel about I think it's something like The Gentleman in Moscow. It's a novel.
I've read that. Oh yeah, that's a great book.
Okay, yeah. you did that one. That's a great book, right? That's the best.
You must know this one, right? A Gentleman in Moscow.
The Red Notice.
Pardon?
I remember the author's
the author. Well, I could look it up as we're speaking.
Yeah. Is that The Red Notice by Bill Browder?
No. I'll tell you in a second. Yeah, that's a great book. I've recommended that to many friends. It's called A Gentleman in Moscow, and the author is Amor Towles, Towles.
Right.
I recommend it to all of your listeners.
Yeah.
What is
And
it about?
he has another book which is also recommendable, but not quite as memorable, I didn't think, but it's a great. He writes superbly well, and they're very engaging stories. Yeah.
Mm. And do you sometimes listen to some podcasts as well? If yes, then which ones?
Well, you could probably guess my answer since I don't do social media. I also don't do podcasts.
All right.
Actually, I do, but I mainly usually listen to history podcasts. So there's this guy, Mike Duncan, who does a series called Revolutions. He began with a long series of podcasts on the on Rome, on ancient Rome. Now he's done a series on various revolutions, kind of the English Revolution, French Revolution, American Revolution. Now he's doing the Russian Revolution. So yeah, I listen to podcasts. I'm also getting a bit more into Audible books than I was, partly because our book is also available as an audio book. So I listened a bit to that, and I thought, well, actually, audiobooks can be quite entertaining. But yeah,
the thing about asking what kind of books we read, I also read history and some fiction, but it turns out that most history books have a tax angle. So the last history book I read is called Alaric the Goth, and it's about the fall of the Roman Empire, told from the point of view not so much of the Romans, but of the Goths and their leader, Alaric. And as I was reading it, sure enough, there was this great story about how a Roman Empire granted citizenship to people who lived outside of Rome. And some people think he did it because it raised revenue, because if you were a citizen, you owed inheritance tax. If you were not a citizen, you did not. Now, Mick and I have not investigated how true that is, but it is just amazing in how often in history books tax issues come up.
Right. I fully agree. We came to that conclusion with several of our guests of this podcast as well. Then going back to the book itself, you briefly told who should be interested or who might be interested in the book, but what would be your top choice of a story if you need to choose one from the book?
Well, I can see both of you as we're talking, so I can pick a tax that all of us could relate to, which is Peter the Great's beard tax. When he decided to westernize Russia in 1698, he introduced many policies, but one was a tax on beards. The intent being that he had noticed that many of his nobles had long beards, but the countries he wanted Russia to emulate, England and France, this was not true. So one of the ways he tried to get his nobles to look more like the Brits and the French was to put a tax on beards. And if you were out in public, if you were a noble and out in public, you had to display a token, which basically said, I paid my beard tax. And if not, you were subject to heavy penalties. I sent a replica of, you can buy a replica of this token on the internet. And a few years ago, I sent it to Mick as a holiday present. This is back when only Mick had a beard and I didn't. Now the incidence of the tax, as we say in economics, would be more widespread.
Right. And for you, Mick?
Well, there's a lot to choose from. I think I like, it always makes me smile, a story about the bachelor tax, and that particularly in Argentina in the 19th century. Of course, a lot of countries, going back to ancient Rome and so on, have had particular taxes on bachelors on the grounds maybe that, if you're a bachelor, you have in some sense higher ability to pay, as things were in those days. Maybe to encourage people to have to be married, have children. So you can see some kind of rationale for the tax. But in Argentina and maybe other places too, some bright spark had the thought, well, what do we do about men who've proposed to a woman that she's turned him down? So they've really done everything they can not to be bachelors, but they're unhappy in love and they're stuck with being a bachelor. So what do? Well, the answer was we give an exemption. So we give an exemption if you can prove that you have proposed to a woman and she's turned you down. So basically, tax people will know what's going to happen next. So there emerged a class of professional lady rejectors who, for a small sum, would swear and sign whatever form they needed to that you had proposed to them and they had turned you down. So I like to think of this kindly soul who created this tax exemption. But as so often, there is a lesson about, well, tax exemptions may be well-intentioned, but they can be pretty much open to abuse. So I kind of like that one.
Another lesson of both these stories is that often some taxes aren't there to raise revenue. They're there in order to change behavior. Peter the Great wanted most of his nobles to shave their beard. In the bachelor tax, it was designed mostly to get young men to marry. And of course, that is a very prominent aspect of many taxes today. Carbon taxes, taxes on congested roads. They raise revenue, but their primary purpose is to get people and businesses to change behavior.
Right. I can feel the readership will increase also after these stories. And is there a tax-related story that comes to your mind that is not in your book? I don't know, either from Joel already mentioned from a history book, but something maybe for you, Nick?
Trying to think, because we have left a lot out. I'm trying to think specifically of what we've left out. I think we did think about this issue Joel raised of the Roman tax on citizenship, how that worked out. But Joel's kind of told you about the story on that. Was there anything else come to mind, Joel?
Well, some of the things that aren't in the book.
There were a couple that were just so awful in terms of abusive taxation that we left out. And we won't even talk about. There were some truly horrible taxes in history that we really can't, it'd just be too upsetting to mention. But other than that, Joel, what did we leave out?
Well, some we didn't leave out, but some stories they're more recent. We learned about, or they happened after we finished the book. For example, in the U.S., there is a recent episode where the federal government is giving these huge grants to state governments during the COVID era, and one of the conditions was that states couldn't use these grants to just lower their own taxes. And I don't know if it's happened, but some state attorney generals in Republican states threatened to sue the federal government for restricting the use of these funds. And the general point here is often constitutions that countries have constrain the tax policies that countries can adopt. And sometimes probably not for good. We tell stories about the constitutions of India and Pakistan, which arguably constrain appropriate tax policy. So yeah, there are a couple things that, these things keep coming up. And so when we write the second edition of the book, which probably won't be for another 50 years, we have to include these new stories.
Right. I see that you have done a huge amount of work writing this book. So after all this work, are there any takeaways you see that the governments need to take into consideration also nowadays?
Well, in the last chapter, we collect the lessons that permeate the rest of the book, and so we end with 11 lessons that we have learned from thinking about taxes through the millennia. I'll just mention one, which is that governments should not underestimate the creativity and the willingness of taxpayers to find ways to minimize the tax burden, either through legal means avoidance or illegal means evasion. And one of the chapters of the book goes into all the amazing avoidance devices that we learn about through history. And with that is that in designing tax policy, governments should think early on about how the tax is going to be enforced. You can't just announce the tax, sit back and let the money roll in. You got to think about what people and businesses will do to avoid it, and try to get the enforcement regime, a good enforcement regime in place right away.
Just maybe to mention one other lesson, which I think is kind of straightforward but can't be stressed enough, which is the this kind of game of how people choose to name taxes is something that we really need to kind of train people to look beyond, because you know, as economists, of course, we're always keen to stress that one has to be thoughtful about who really bears the burden of the tax. You have to think through how the market will adjust, and certainly be careful about the labels that people with particular interests will attach to taxes to try to persuade you who the real incidence falls on in a way that serves their own interest. And everybody plays this game: governments, lobbyists, everybody plays, civil society, everybody plays these games. The classic example is it's in the US. The policy of one pressure group basically always to refer to the estate and gift tax as the death tax, even though, as Joel will explain or will tell us, death is neither necessary nor sufficient for paying the estate duty. And this label of the death tax has really stuck, and seems, perhaps, you know, one can believe it's had some impact on the policy debate. Even though, as one of our colleagues points out, in terms of the way it affects the attractions of being alive and being dead, you could also call it the life subsidy, which would give it maybe a different flavor. Another example is the way that some groups have labeled a financial transactions tax, a tax that would be on all kinds of financial transactions, have chosen to label that the Robin Hood tax, presumably to convey some idea that the real incidence of this is going to fall on well-paid bankers and people in the financial sector, when it's not at all clear that would be the case. The real burden might well be borne by ordinary savers. So I think, again, and it seems a game that people play more and more, is my impression, of giving fancy names to taxes. So it's not always easy to know who really bears the burden of the tax, but at least we should all get into the habit of really not looking at how some particular interest group chooses to label it. But we have 9 other lessons and other great stories, so we'll they're all in the book. But you have to get to the end to get to those, I'm afraid. So yeah. Right.
And the book is available on many platforms. I think the easiest for readers is to go to Amazon and buy one.
Yep.
I wanted to ask a question that I don't have an answer for myself about the progressive taxation. Do you support? And there's a chapter in the book as well about the progressive taxation. Do you support the idea of progressive income tax? Basically, it means the more you earn, the higher tax rate you pay, and basically that means that those who push themselves to learn more or to risk in business more have to pay higher rates than those who choose to take it easy and go with the flow.
Well, let me start on that one. And first, I'll answer your question directly. So I do support the idea that a modern tax system should be progressive in the way you said, that the average tax rate on income should be higher the more income people have. I support that, but I want to say that whether one supports that or not depends on some questions of economics, such as how does a progressive tax affect people's willingness to work hard, to get educated, do all the things one needs to do to earn more income. It depends on that, but it also depends on one's values about inequality. And that's not really an economics question. We economists can help measure inequality, talk about the implications of policies for inequality, but the value a society places on inequality is really a question not for economists, but for philosophers and ethicists, etc. So when I say I'm in favor of it, that depends both on my views on the economic questions, but also on my values.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think Joe, from my side, I think Joel puts it very well. Very little to add. Even to note that, a lot of the, even if you have a flat tax, the kind that, many countries adopted after the Russian flat tax reform, to the extent that has an exempt amount, that's a progressive tax in the sense that so again, we always, I think, have to be careful to distinguish between the marginal tax rate, the tax on an additional dollar or euro, and the average. But Joel's quite right. It becomes an ethical issue at some point. Plus, of course, I think we're always very keen to say that one should look at the whole tax system, look at the impact of the income tax, the VAT, all kinds of taxes, as well as on the spending side. So to some extent, how progressive one tax taken on its own may look is not necessarily the key question. So many people who like progressive taxation, for example, would support a very strong single rate value added tax, because even though that is not progressive in itself, it may help to build a more progressive spending side, for example. So again, I think one has to look at the whole system. But Joel puts it very nicely in terms of this the role that ethics and individual judgments come to play.
Mm. And still on the progressive taxation, I saw that Piketty is suggesting to tax wealth with progressive rates because it grows faster than the GDP of countries. Do you agree with those ideas?
Well, the wealth tax was on the front pages in the U.S. in 2019 because two candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination favored it. This is Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, two American senators. So they had a proposal for wealth taxes, annual wealth taxes, with the rates going as high as 6, 7, or 8% for the very, very wealthy. So it's been a hot topic. I mean, they weren't nominated, obviously, and they're not president. And President Biden has tax proposals which would increase progressivity, but which would not do it through a wealth tax. And let me just say, this comes back to this question of constitutionality, because not only were economists involved in this debate, but so were constitutional lawyers, because it's not at all clear that a federal wealth tax would be constitutional in the United States, and so might be overturned on legal grounds, even before economists get to weigh in.
Mm. Right.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to weigh in on the wealth tax issue, but maybe just to make a couple of points. One is this clearly ties in very much with another of the lessons of the book, which is the whole question of international tax coordination, how far that should be taken, because it's kind of hard to see wealth taxes working without a considerable degree of coordination, or at least cooperation. And also, of course, many people would say, well, maybe before we think about the wealth tax, we should try to fix capital income taxes that we have at the moment in terms of treatment of capital gains and so on. So there's also, I think, that aspect to the debate. And we really want to invest in new instruments, which, as Joel says, may have particular problems, say in the US, maybe administrative issues elsewhere, or do we want to really bite the bullet on some of the taxes that we already have, in terms of making them do their jobs more effectively.
Right. Make you were consulting more than 30 countries around the world. Do you see some typical problems with the tax systems in Eastern Europe? And let's say if you would be in charge of tax system in a small country like Latvia with 2 million people, what would you do? Would you change anything to? Of course, you probably don't know the details of the system, but do you see some typical problems that can be cured right now?
Well, I think many of the tax systems in the region actually have some attractive properties, as far as I understand it, in terms of relative simplicity. In terms more generally of the issues that we face, I think the VAT is an issue more or less in all countries in different ways, and probably particularly one might argue in sort of older Europe in a way, with these kind of rather old VATs that are beginning to show their age. But even if we go to developing countries where the VAT is a major source of revenue, there's often room for improvement in the structuring of the VAT, particularly I think now, given that many countries are going to be looking for additional sources of revenue coming out of COVID. And COVID is really, I think, heightening many of the tax problem or tax issues that were there before the pandemic. So issues of VAT design, of course, there's a whole corporate tax issue that we know is getting a lot of headlines these days. So I think there are newer issues coming up. Of course, there are issues to do with carbon taxation, which kind of dates back to or goes back to the theme Joel was mentioning of using taxes primarily for corrective purposes in the spirit of Peter the Great. But that, I think, is becoming an increasing issue in many countries. It obviously does have some potential revenue advantages. So there are a variety of issues around there. This current issue of border carbon adjustments, I think, is going to be a big one for the coming period. So I wouldn't want to delve too much into the region, but I think certainly when you look more globally, there are many common issues. Whole issues about digitalization, the impact that might have on tax systems, where I think the region you're talking about clearly has many stellar examples of how to approach those problems. But there's a great sort of commonality of problems, I think, maybe more than one might suspect across advanced, emerging, and developing countries.
Joel, do you see any typical problems in the Eastern European region from your perspective?
The answer is no, and that's just because I'm not familiar with the tax structures, so I really shouldn't venture an opinion. As I mentioned, I have visited Estonia and Lithuania, but both times I was there as a tourist, not as a professional economist. So I didn't go out of my way to learn about the tax system. So I probably should pass on that one.
Right. And Mick, you mentioned the VAT. Do you see this VAT fraud and lack of neutrality sometimes problem? How to solve that? You both are based in the US. Is the US sales tax system better from your perspective, or do you see some good answer there?
Well, let me go first on that one. So Yes, clearly the VAT has problems. There have been fraud problems, often very clever frauds. Sometimes you're kind of quite impressed with how intellectually clever the frauds are. But I think it's true that any tax is going to have these fraud problems. And we know there are various estimates of the VAT gap, a lot of estimates for Europe. And it's not clear, at least to me, that the VAT gap is wider necessarily, say, than the income tax gap. I think often VAT fraud gets a lot of attention because it makes good press. But you know, when you have a few youngsters with mobile phones managing to execute multi-million euro VAT frauds, that gets a lot of attention, whereas some of the kind of evasion that goes on with the income tax doesn't get such headlines. So I don't want to downplay the problems with the VAT, but it's clear, I think, that many of these problems we shouldn't overstate in terms of their importance. We should recognize that all taxes have had similar issues. And I think there are ways in which we can address some of these. I think coming back to digitalization, there's a lot of interesting initiatives now. And in a way, there's a bit of an arms race, I think, between tax administrations who can be adept at using digital methods, but also fraudsters too. We know there have been very clever use of digital technologies to exploit some of the processes that tax administrations use. So I don't think one should be despondent about the VAT, and it's notable, I think, that a number of countries that have kind of got rid of a VAT, I think there may be 5 or 6 that have introduced the VAT and got rid of it. They've all reintroduced it in some, with one exception so far. They've all reintroduced it in some way, which certainly suggests to me that the VAT, particularly at the levels of revenue that we're talking about, is a potentially very effective, arguably effective and useful tax, probably more so, I'd say, than the sales tax. But I should let Joel give his views on the US sales tax approach.
Yeah, we are the most notable country that does not have a federal value-added tax, where now 160 or more countries have one. We don't have a federal retail sales tax either, but last time I looked, 45 of our 50 states have a retail sales tax. And so you asked whether a retail sales tax is less susceptible to fraud than a value-added tax. And I would say, in principle, the answer to that question is no. I think structurally, the value-added tax is actually better than a retail sales tax, because the weakest link in the chain of tax collection is the chain between retailers and sales to final consumers. And obviously a retail sales tax, that's where all the revenue is. And for a value-added tax, it's only a relatively small piece. So, yeah, I mean, certainly fraud of a value-added tax is an issue. As Mick said, it's an issue for all taxes. But I certainly wouldn't recommend a retail sales tax as the panacea for eliminating fraud.
Mm.
Maybe there's even a story from our book that illustrates some of this, which is in the early 18th century in England, we had a problem with people drinking gin, kind of excessive crime and general unpleasantness on the street. So the government introduced a tax on gin, again, in the spirit of changing behavior rather than raising revenue. But initially they imposed it at the retail stage. And that really didn't work. Nothing happened, because even in London, there were thousands of retailers. And imposing a tax at the retail stage just didn't work. And they kept trying this, increasing the rate and so on, until they hit on the idea, well, why don't we levy the tax at the wholesale stage instead? Because there were only about 12 wholesalers in London. And then the tax worked, and consumption began to fall. So they hadn't quite cottoned on to the idea of a value-added tax, hadn't quite realized the full beauty to some of us of a value-added tax, but they certainly realized, well, actually, to Joel's point, you know, putting all your reliance on collecting tax at the retail stage may not be such a great idea.
Right. Maybe now just a couple of words on the latest news about the 1st of July announcements about Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 taxation of multinationals in the market countries and the global minimum corporate tax. What's your take of that news? Is this just the beginning of some bigger plan, or do you see some further actions happening after these pillars will be finally adopted, hopefully in October?
Well, from my side, I mean, I think the headline is that, for me at least, that these are really historic developments. That even 2 or 3 years ago, the things that we're talking about now were almost things you couldn't talk about in polite tax society. Particularly the idea that some taxing rights might be given to the market countries. To me, an element of destination-based taxation. I would say 4 or 5 years ago, it was almost unheard of, almost, I say, impolite to refer to destination-based taxation. To say anything that might weaken the scope of the arm's length pricing principle was also very impolite. So I think that the fact that we've accepted conceptually both of those notions is a real step forward, and to me a very welcome one. Similarly, I think with the Pillar 2 notion of minimum taxation, and it certainly ties in with discussion we have in the book, as we were mentioning, about the need for greater international coordination, the risk of mutually damaging tax competition. I think I wouldn't speculate on where this might lead. Of course, some people will find the system complicated and rather not a kind of a mixture of different principles. But I think from my side, I would simply really congratulate people involved in the process in actually being pretty open to new and I think potentially helpful approaches to international tax.
Right. Joel, did you hear the question? Sounds like Joel has left us.
Yeah, I don't see him there.
Yeah, it's all right. We are almost at the end of our 1 hour. So Mick, just to continue on what you said about those pillars, this Pillar 2, this global minimum tax, do you see this putting an end to aggressive tax planning through offshores, or do you see this as a problem at all?
Do you know, Yanis, I think I better pass on that just because of the IMF thing. It's such a contentious topic.
All right. I
think I shouldn't go beyond my last.
No worries. No worries.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. My last question is traditional one at the end of every podcast to every of our guests. So just maybe to finish up in a couple of sentences, what is on a philosophical note, what is your version of meaning of life for you?
By the way, guys, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Joel,
what I miss?
We were talking just about one topic, which was Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 news in 1st of July. So what's your take on that?
I presume, Mick, you already responded to that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, well, I can talk a bit about the global minimum tax. Is there still room for me to comment on that?
Sure,
yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So I think the idea of a global minimum tax is aimed at a real problem in the international tax system. I think there's no question that some jurisdictions tried to act in a parasitical way on the revenues of other countries. Sometimes they're called tax havens, but I think everyone knows what I'm talking about. So I think it's a real issue that I'm happy to see the international tax community try to address. I am not convinced that a global minimum tax is going to be easy to implement. And that's because you can't just assign a minimum statutory tax rate and expect that will get rid of the problem. There are many, many ways countries can become attractive for tax reasons other than the statutory rate. So I think the devil is in the details here, but I look forward to seeing ideas about how to make it work.
Right. And you partially, Joel, touched upon the problems of offshore. Can you comment something on your perspective of would this global minimum taxation somehow limit the aggressive tax planning through offshores?
I think in principle it can, and as I said, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to think about how to change the rules to minimize that problem. I think it's a very difficult problem, though. I mean, the information sharing agreements that are in place now, I think for individual tax evasion are a promising start. I'm sure your listeners know about the U.S. FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, that many countries have now have legislation or regulations like that. I think these are very promising. We don't have a lot of compelling evidence about their consequences, how successful they've been, but I think it's absolutely the right way to go to think about international sharing of tax information to make enforcement better.
Right. And it will be interesting to see many aspects how these ideas will develop, including the ones, for example, that Latvia and Estonia have different corporate tax system, that the corporate tax is deferred to the moment of distribution of profits. So basically, then it will be interesting to see whether these countries will be pushed to change their systems, where we see that Estonia already have capped out of the agreement of these more than 130 countries. So it will be an interesting development to monitor. Right, we have passed this 1 hour which we have agreed to spend on this. I really am thankful for you. Really enjoyed the conversation, and traditionally at the end of the conversation I ask my guests on more philosophical note about your version of meaning of life as a tax person. What would you answer to that?
Well, I'll give you my version of the meaning of life, but not as a tax person. To me, if you look forward to going to work and you look forward to coming home from work, you have a good life.
Right. Brilliant. And you, Mick?
That's
try to top that, Mick.
It's kind of above my pay grade, I think, these questions. No, I kind of just I'm just a great believer in kindness and forgiveness. Seem to me two great virtues that we should be trying to display every day. Right. But I'll let you know when I have the answer. Don't worry.
Perfect.
That would be a bigger seller, I think.
Maybe one day we will make another episode of the podcast.
Yeah.
Very Perfect. Good. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yeah. It was really a pleasure, and I really enjoyed the book as well. Thank you.
Okay. So long. Have a good one.
See you later.
Have a good day.
See you,
Bye.
man.